Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at what is very much, 1 week after those talks in Geneva, an escalation in Ukraine, both domestically and just outside the borders, with the Russians restarting military maneuvers, U.S. deploying to neighboring Poland. We're talking about it with Douglas Herbert, France 24 international affairs editor, who is in the eastern Ukrainian city of Donetsk. We're also talking about it with Igor RESHETNIAK of the Euro-Maidan collective, and Marcin ZABOROWSKI, director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Jolyon, who teaches international relations and security policy at Yale and Bath universities. And from London, we're pleased to welcome back Jim Brann of the Stop the War Coalition. We're talking about how there are various shades. Jim Brann made the point in part one of our discussion, various shades of opinion in eastern Ukraine, far different from Crimea. France 24's Luke Brown reported from the town of Kramatorsk, where it's proving incredibly difficult to gauge the outcome or the strength of the stakeholders.
For the past week, these Ukrainian soldiers have been holed up in Kramatorsk military airbase. Despite their armoured vehicles, they haven't broken through the separatist barricades. The roadblock here is currently manned by just Sasha, a 19-year-old local boy. Kramatorsk is one of the eastern Ukrainian towns to have partially fallen under separatist control. Heavily armed paramilitaries setting up HQ in the former Ukrainian Security Services building. Separatists have arrested the local police chief and seized official vehicles. But here in Kramatorsk, the militiamen are rarely seen on the streets. They aren't wholly welcome.
They behave very aggressively, and that alarms me.
Look how much suffering they are bringing, how many people have died. And all these people carrying their weapons, they've had no training. That's not good.
A certain freedom of expression in Kramatorsk, then, that no longer exists 20 kilometers away in Slavyansk, the armed stronghold of the separatist movement. In the central square, tributes have sprung up to the victims of a deadly shootout over the Easter weekend. For the supporters of the pro-Russian authorities, the 3 dead men are heroes. Preparing for a siege, the separatists here accept no dissent, as a spate of arbitrary arrests and abductions demonstrates. The mouthpiece for the Slavyansk rebellion, the self-proclaimed mayor.
There's an old law that says the minority must submit to the majority. We're ready to repulse any attack. We'll never cede an inch of our territory to the invader.
A belligerent and uncompromising message from the separatist leader. As the militants dig in, local people are caught in the middle. The mayor has already warned he's willing to turn Slavyansk into a battlefield, likening it to the siege of Stalingrad.
All right, and this, of course, coming as we got news earlier in the week of the killing of a city councilman, Vladimir Rybak. He was pro-Kiev and appears to have been abducted by separatist gunmen. An American journalist who was held for a couple of days by pro-Russian insurgents in eastern Ukraine has been released as well. Let me ask you about this, Igor RESHETNIAK. When you see the situation now, and you see that report, is there any way that there can be dialogue among Ukrainians to resolve this?
Well, first of all, it's quite questionable whether this Donetsk Republic actually represents the local population, because one has to understand that even in this Donetsk region, there are at least 4 parties that are pretending to be the government. So first of all, there is the central Ukrainian government, then there is this Donetsk Republic, then there is also the Party of Regions, who had a big assembly of local deputies who were supposedly elected by local people, and then there are also some other green men, etc., who are also pretending to be the government. So the big question is, whom do you negotiate with? So in my opinion, one should negotiate with the people. And the question is that I don't doubt this Donetsk Republic is actually representing all of those people. And as this leader in Sloviansk said, that he will not stand down, that he's representing the majority, I would actually question that.
Douglas Herbert, when you were in Sloviansk, did you get a sense of popular fervor for the separatists?
Well, Sloviansk is an exceptional town in the sense right now that it's perhaps the most die-hard of the strongholds. We spoke to quite a few people in Sloviansk yesterday, not today, because as I said, the town was mostly deserted. A lot of people were staying at home today. But yesterday, the vast majority of people out on the streets that we spoke to sympathized and with the separatist cause. There was only really one woman that we spoke to who dared to sort of express a dissenting view. And she almost whispered it to us because she was really scared of speaking too loudly. Earlier, she had been in a crowd of people, and she suggested that perhaps the three men who were killed in that weekend shootout weren't killed by Ukrainian ultranationalists from the Pravi sector group. Perhaps it was another explanation of what happened. She said she was nearly beaten up. She got very, very scared, which was why she was very reluctant to talk. She wouldn't talk to our cameras. She was literally just whispering to us. But I would say outside of Sloviansk and in Kramatorsk, we went around a local park yesterday just speaking to people. And it's interesting, a lot of people there really disagree with the methods of the separatists, of at least the most diehard separatists, François. What they do say is, listen, we all want to live in peace. A lot of it's economic. They say we all want to work. We want to live well. We want to live under a system that will allow us to have the best lives possible. They feel their grievances aren't being heard, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they necessarily want to go as far as some of the separatists, the guys manning the barricades, the guys wielding the weapons I was speaking about, are going. But so there are people who do express dissenting views, and going back to what your guest said earlier, absolutely right. A lot of people do stay home or do not go out on the streets and do not necessarily agree with everything that's going on here. We only hear from the people that do agree because they tend to be the most vocal and the most visible.
So Jim Brann, I'll put it to you. Who do you negotiate with, and do you have that election on May the 25th that now Moscow is casting doubts over?
I suspect that the election on May the 25th will be extremely problematic because the whole of the Ukrainian political situation has been internationalized. It was internationalized really from the beginning, even from, you know, when the American Secretary of State for European Affairs handed out cookies in Maidan Square. And no doubt Russia is playing a role, no doubt at all. I mean, of course, apart from Crimea. But the whole thing has been internationalized. And I don't think that you can have a very effective or recognized election in those conditions. It may well be that those people who support the new government support the election, and those people who don't support the new government in Kiev don't support the election. But this internationalization is a problem.
Well, Marcin ZABOROWSKI?
I think this is what Russia basically wanted all along. Russia didn't want to have an election which could give further legitimacy to the government in Kiev. Basically, it's in Russian interest that you have a chaos, that you have the governments which legitimacy is being questioned, and it can play with that, with the levers. And hence, I think that part of that, what is going on now in Slaviansk, in Kramatorsk, in Donetsk and elsewhere, was exactly for that purpose. Not necessarily to create facts on the ground, so to take these towns away from Ukraine, but actually to wreck the entire election process and to continue doing that. I think this is what Putin is really after. He basically does not want to allow the cessation of the current situation when with the legitimacy being uncleared there.
Do you have a problem with an election on May the 25th, Jolyon?
I think there are going to be a lot of problems with the elections on May 25th of the sort that Jim Brann just outlined. I happen to agree with almost everybody here. I agree with Igor that the situation in the East is unreadable, and nobody can say that this lot or that lot or the other lot represent the people there. The people there represent sort of about 50% of the population of Ukraine, and under the Yanukovych government, the vast majority of the ministers were all from this part of Ukraine. Under the new government, equally vast proportion are from the West. So it's very difficult to talk about representation. But I agree entirely with Marcin that Putin's primary objective, I think, all along has been to disrupt and to destabilize the government in Kiev. I think a secondary objective, a more profound objective, is to prevent Ukraine as a whole, or any part of Ukraine, from becoming certainly a member of NATO, but even recently too attached to the European Union. Right. And that's a very long-term historical...
Or even for Ukraine to actually have any free choice in its foreign policy.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing, the whole bullying tactic by Moscow started from objection to the association agreement with the EU.
Yeah.
I mean, it went well beyond the whole issue of NATO.
All right, let's hear from the man himself. After the announcement by the Russian Defense Ministry of military maneuvers on the border earlier in the day, the Russian president weighing in, warning Ukraine's interim government that deploying the army to the east would constitute, quote, a very serious crime against its own people.
First of all, they do not have a nationwide mandate. In the best-case scenario, they only have some elements of legitimacy, and then only in parliament. All the other legitimate authorities have, for one reason or another, turned out to be illegitimate. This is not an acute phase of confrontation. It's more of a sort of counterinsurgency operation. It will have consequences, undoubtedly, for the decision-makers and for relations between our states. We'll see how the situation develops, and we'll draw conclusions based on the realities of the situation.
Is that a threat?
Oh, absolutely. What he's basically saying is, you know, any action in the east has no legitimacy. The Ukrainian forces shouldn't be there. They have no right to operate freely in the east of their own country. And if they do so, then they would draw conclusions and perhaps intervene themselves. That's why Ukrainian forces have been so timid, because they don't want to give any pretext to these 50,000 Russian troops to intervene. That's why they let the separatists to, you know, take one stronghold after another, and best they can do, they fire warning shots. They just don't want to give the Russians any pretext. But you know, basically, this is the Ukrainian territory.
Does Vladimir Putin have a plan here, or is he improvising?
Well, that's what everybody is asking themselves. Does he have a plan? Does he know how far he's prepared to go? And there are very, very different opinions about that. I think clearly he wants to destabilize. Clearly he wants to draw Ukraine towards the east and away from the west. Whether he wants to invade, I think that's the really difficult one. I think most strategic analysts take the view that it's not in his interest to invade. He's already having difficulty digesting Crimea. The Russian troops not all that hot. There is a lot of evidence that Ukrainians will resist.
But has he perhaps talked himself into a corner?
He may well have opened up a he may have, you know, it's difficult to put the toothpaste back into the tube. I think that's the image that comes to mind here. He's opened up a Pandora's box, changing the metaphor, which he does not control. But it is, in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of people in the United States with whom I've been talking, international relations strategists, that it would be very foolish of Putin to go so far as to actually invade Ukraine. He will have a huge job living with that and managing it. And it'll go on for a very long time.
Jim Brann,
but whether he can avoid it at this point...
Except he's done it already with Crimea.
Well, he's done it in Crimea.
Jim Brann, do you agree?
Yeah, my sense is that two things. Russia does not want the relatively backward industry of the eastern Ukraine, is one thing. It doesn't really want the burden of that. The other thing is, of course, if it does detach the opposition section of Ukraine, then it has a far more united Ukraine rump, the 80% of Ukraine that's left to contend with. So on balance, no, I'm sure he's calculating this every minute. I think that clearly this doctrine that he's put forward of the responsibility to protect Russians is a factor. There's no doubt that's a factor on events in Ukraine, but I suspect that he just wants to keep that as a factor rather than to actually play that card.
On that point, I mean, Putin has used the analogy of Kosovo again and again and again. And this is a very unfortunate situation where Kosovo has now been used and is being used all the time as a precedent for the sorts of very, very different things that Russia is trying to do in this part of the world. I mean, there is nothing comparable between the doctrine of responsibility to protect as it's gone through the United Nations and the way in which Putin is using it. But nevertheless, we in the West have created a precedent and we're living with the consequences of it.
And earlier in the day, Barack Obama on a trip of the Far East speaking for the first time in quite a while, since before those Geneva talks of a week ago, the U.S. president employing the S word, sanctions.
There was some possibility that Russia could take a wiser course after the meetings in Geneva. So far, at least, we have seen them not abide by the spirit or the letter of the agreement in Geneva. If, once again, Russia fails to abide by both the spirit and the letter of what was discussed in Geneva, that there will be further consequences and we will ramp up further sanctions.
Marcin ZABOROWSKI, is that the right response?
Well, I think it is. I think it is definitely the right response. I mean, I wish it happened earlier. Sanctions at the moment are very, very mild. They really just concern a very selected group of people. One of which, by the way, will be speaking in opening a conference in Paris in a few days' time. So far, sanctions have been largely symbolic. The impact have been really. The real impact have been by sending a message to the business community, stay away. And that actually happened. But we really have to get very, very serious about sanctions now. To get to the core of what can actually persuade Russia to stop, its further, meddling in Ukrainian affairs and go even further. Because from this press conference or meeting with the nation, as Putin calls it, he made it very clear that he considers, southeast Ukraine essentially Russian. And he also made it clear that he sees it as his job to protect Russian minority, Russian-speaking people around the world. And he didn't mention, London or Silicon Valley in that context.
Jim Brand, do you agree that it will only be a show of strength that will bring Vladimir Putin to the table?
Russia has massively increased its military spending in recent years. If you read what Putin said on March the 18th, at the time of the incorporation of Ukraine,
Crimea.
Read that and then study what Obama said on, I think, the 26th in Brussels. You have two completely different trajectories. Putin says basically everything has changed, and Obama says basically nothing has changed. And so far on balance, you can say, if you take at least the last couple of years, you can say that Putin's right. And it is a straight power clash. And that's the problem. And there's many things that Putin said when he spoke about missile defense. If you look at his speech, he said, you lie to us. You keep lying to us. And you take missile defense as a very good example. You pretend that you put missile defense in Poland to protect from Iran, and we know perfectly well it's aimed at us. So no, I think they've done that calculation already.
Let me ask you, Douglas Herbert. We know that Vladimir Putin's popularity soared to 80% after the takeover of Crimea. What's his street cred, if you will, where you are right now?
Well, listen, once again, going back to what a lot of the guests have been saying and what I've also been observing is there is no great love for Vladimir Putin here. Like I was saying, a lot of this population, they simply want to be heard. They simply want to have greater autonomy to sort of determine their own fates, if you will. So it's not so much a sense of we want to break away and join Russia and be under Putin and his thumb. It's not that at all. Putin is respected by a lot of people here, but they by no means want him necessarily to be their overlord and their leader. You're right. Putin's popularity did play extremely well to the domestic audience, and it was the highest that it had been since he started his third term a couple of years back, near 80% level, which is stratospheric popularity. Here, it's not as high. Yes, at the checkpoints, you often see signs saying, Putin, come save us, come help us, come rescue us, direct appeals to Putin. And we obviously, the self-proclaimed mayor of Slavyansk that we saw in the report earlier, Vyacheslav Ponomaryov, he himself appealed directly to Vladimir Putin to send troops and to provide arms to the people in his town. But he does not reflect, my sense at least from the people we've been speaking to, is he does not reflect the will and the desires of most people here. Putin's respected. He's seen as, yes, the leader of a neighboring and strong country, but he's not necessarily seen as a man that the people here whose authority they want to submit to. They simply want to preserve their ties with Russia, the business ties, the economic ties. They want to have good relations with Russia, but they want to, a lot of people here want to do it within still a united Ukraine, albeit one in which they have greater autonomy.
All right. At the outset of this discussion, we talked about Douglas Herbert was describing to us basically Ukrainian government tanks going into the hot spots there in the east this Thursday and sort of testing the waters. And it could backfire, is what our panel talked about. In Poland on Wednesday, the first group of a contingent of around 600 U.S. soldiers arriving. They're seen as part of Washington's effort to reassure its East European allies. I want to ask you, Marcin ZABOROWSKI, is this going to just be another red rag to a bull, or is this really going to help bring all sides to the table?
I don't think it's about bringing sides to the table. I think it's about really giving some credibility to the notion of collective defense, which at the moment, for the last really years since Poland and Baltic states have joined NATO, you didn't have any serious NATO presence at the territory of these states. You really didn't have any serious exercises. You didn't have any planning for the in case there was a real threat to this area. And basically, what is happening now is a sort of a demonstration and showing that we are serious about collective defense, and we are serious about sending a signal to Mr. Putin that. Definitely NATO territory is out of the boundary, and don't even think about it.
Jolyon Howard?
I mean, I don't think it's a red rag to a bull either, but it is a signal which could be taken in the wrong way. The problem here is that Ukraine is not a member state of NATO, and the, I think, overwhelming consensus within the NATO alliance, other than saying we have to do something to stand up to Putin, the overwhelming consensus is that military instruments are not part of that solution. Yeah. Therefore, I think that there's a danger here, and it's a danger...
So don't bring your guns unless you want to use them.
It's a danger we saw in Kosovo because we warned Milosevic, George H.W. Bush warned him, Clinton warned him, don't be nasty to the Kosovars or we're going to have to do something. And eventually, NATO was obliged to do it, and the results are not good. So I think it's not in anybody's interest at this stage to be making military threats or making military movements which could indeed backfire.
But Jolyon, I mean, nobody's making military threats. It's 150 troops that arrived in Poland.
Okay.
No. On the Ukrainian territory, right next to the Ukrainian territory, you have 50,000 Russian troops in high readiness. And on the Ukrainian territory, you have agents operating and special forces operating.
Okay, Marcin, but what is the message then to Putin?
The message to Putin is,
what?
Well, I think the message to Putin is quite clear. It is, we are serious about collective defense of the NATO member states.
Okay.
That's it, really.
Okay.
And
for the moment.
And so far, really, like I said, there was no any serious, NATO presence at the territories of the member states for precisely the reason that you are talking about. So, because that could upset Russia.
All right. Okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there because there's a lot more to talk about. Igor RESHETNIAK, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Jolyon HOWORTH, Marcin ZABOROWSKI. I want to thank from joining us from London, Jim BRANN. and France 24's Douglas Herbert, who's covering events as they unfold in eastern Ukraine. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Sports. 100 meters individual medley for the United States. France 24 keeps you up to date with all the latest from the world of sport. All the action, all the results, all the emotion.
Join Dan Levy for his sport roundup on France 24 and France24.com.